Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Finance Z Podcast, episode 24. Today's guest has one of the most fascinating, original stories you'll hear in the world of investing. From being a U.S. Army Ranger qualified sniper to founding one of the most transformative internet companies in the restaurant industry to now backing the companies he believes can solve the most urgent problems facing our planet. Chuck Templeton is a managing partner and co-lead of S2G Investments, a firm focused on growth and late-stage venture businesses across food, agriculture, energy, and oceans. Before he was an investor, Chuck was an operator and serial entrepreneur. He founded and was the CEO of OpenTable, which fundamentally changed how we experience dining out. He then went on to serve as lead investor and chairman of the board at Grubhub. In today's episode, we talk about his time in the military, the founding of OpenTable, the lessons learned, helping grow Grubhub, AI, and the SaaS apocalypse, and advice to young entrepreneurs and investors. I hope you guys enjoy the podcast. If you do, please leave a five-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And without further ado, let's get into this. Chuck, all right, here we are. Finally
Yeah.
got to get some time on the calendar and do the podcast. Really happy to do this, so welcome to the show. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. So Chuck, I kind of wanted to start with one of the details that I read in your bio that I found very intriguing, which was your military background. You were a U.S. Army Ranger qualified and a sniper. I remember asking my friend at West Point, "What does this mean?" And he just texted me elite, and I was like, "Oh, okay." So I would love to kind of hear a little bit more about the background there, and how did that really shape your experience towards building and leading the companies from your past and even now?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up a little bit of a renegade in high school and stuff like that, and wasn't a great rule follower. Really, the military gave me a little bit of time to mature, frankly, and get a few years of aging under my belt, and it taught me a lot about process. I'm a big fan of process and really thinking through, obviously no plan sort of withstands, the first shot, as they say. But the idea that you've got, training and you work with teams to go solve problems and that you're looking for contingencies and different ways to solve whatever mission or problem you're on, and really focusing on, they talk about commander's intent, like, not exactly what are you going to do, but what is the thing you want to accomplish. And so really thinking through, how do you be creative to solve that particular problem, or whatever problem you're facing. And that to me is, one of the biggest things that I got out of the military, besides, a little bit of time to mature, is really how you look at problem solving and how you think about, getting the mission done and figuring out how to do that first rather than doing it in a particular way.
Got it. So then let's fast forward a little bit, start talking about what a lot of people may know you for is the founding of OpenTable. Um, I would love, I think a lot of my listeners, especially the younger generation, we would love to kind of hear the story on how you founded, grew OpenTable into the success it is now. And ultimately, I was very curious. You left the company before kind of seeing it through its acquisition. Love to hear a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, it started like a lot of ideas start. I was very, keen on sort of the internet as it was starting to materialize. And, I was lucky enough to be here in the San Francisco Bay Area, which, that's, one of the centers of where, at least commercially, the internet, was born. And so, saw a lot of friends joining .coms, thought I'd, just go join one as well. And so applied to about a dozen .coms that were sort of starting. And, none of them said I had enough experience. So I didn't get, any sort of offers anywhere. And I had grown up, sort of paying my way through high school and, an undergrad actually waiting tables. And so I knew how the front of a restaurant worked. And my wife was making restaurant reservations one day for her family that were coming into town the following week. And I saw that she was looking for some very, specific experiences, and got a lot of, on hold, and was calling, it was a Saturday morning, which arguably at the time was probably not the best time to actually make a reservation. And so, I looked at that as I, watched her making this for her family coming in. I'm like, oh, there's got to be a better way. And so quit my job and started. I had no idea, sort of anything about code, anything about, databases, anything about, technology. But what I knew is I knew how to run, the front of a house of a restaurant. And so I took, the mindset of what is the paper-based world that they're using now, and how do I turn that into a digital world, mirroring basically all of the actions, all of the things that they did as much as possible, so that I could move, so I could teach someone how to move from one technology to another technology, but not also one system to another system. So it really tried to
Right.
mirror the system, as they had as it was being used. And then, so, it was yeah, just a lot of fun because I spent a lot of time in restaurants really trying to understand exactly what the host stand did and all that. So, sort of fast forward, we raised a couple rounds, we brought in some senior leadership. We, really tried to set the company up for success. One of the things that sort of is one of my unsolicited piece of advice that I give to a lot of entrepreneurs these days is it really is about, what I focused on is, the idea of being successful, not necessarily of optimizing in case of success, but optimizing for success. And so, how do you figure out how to make whatever you're doing successful? And if it's successful, my sort of experience has been that you'll be successful. And so, with that, I had gotten, some very senior leadership in the organization. The times had been changing, so the dot-com crash had sort of happened, and the idea of, I was a little younger then, the idea of a younger person running companies became less interesting from an investor standpoint. And
Right.
so, we brought in, someone, another, sort of experienced leader who had built massive companies before, and turned it over to that particular individual. I then bounced around the company for a little bit, doing product, doing sales, and just felt like it was the right time for me to go because I really enjoyed that sort of the early stage, and really that it's different kinds of problems you solve when a company's
Sure.
bigger than when it's littler. So it was just time for me to go, and since then it's been fun to watch.
In regards to another question, just kind of came to mind here when you're talking about just early on. I mentioned, I've heard stories on your other interviews where there was one time you almost didn't make payroll. There was another instance where it was just kind of hard for you to get venture funding as well. I want to kind of dive a little bit on just the whole, I guess, setback and rejection that you may face as an entrepreneur. How do you overcome that? I mean, I'm applying to jobs right now and I get rejected, and I mean that's something hard to overcome, and I think that's something a lot of our listeners would want to maybe hear a little bit of how I guess you had that mentality to keep going.
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, I'm a big believer that, well, you're first of all, you're going to get more no's than you are
Yeah,
yeses in your life, right? And so being able to, not take the no's personally to me is a fairly key part of life, frankly. And through time, and I don't know if I had this back then, but through time, I've become more of a stoic, right? So a philosopher, and really thinking about, there's this idea that nothing is good or bad, thinking makes
right.
it so. It's Shakespeare and Hamlet, right? And the idea is, this happened and it is bad is two different things. One is a subjective thing and the other is an objective thing, right? And so to be able to lean in and actually, use that obstacle as a learning opportunity, and
Hmm.
really the ability to be able to turn it from a negative into a positive, to me is a what I've always tried to do. And so I don't know, sort of where that original mindset came from, but I've always thought about, when something doesn't go your way, that's an opportunity to learn. How do you respond? Are you do you get in a little ball on the ground, or do you stand up and actually
Move forward.
move forward and learn from that and get better? So that's something that I just think is you can't take everything personally, because there's all kinds of random reasons why you get no. Could be that you're trying to raise capital from someone and they would have said yes, but whatever, their kid breaks an arm and they disappear for 2 weeks, at the
Yeah.
hospital trying to help their kid with the arm, and that had nothing to do with you. It hadn't,
Yeah.
it just was, bad luck, right? And that's only bad luck if you call it bad luck. So that to me is, how do you not overthink something that, doesn't go the way you'd hoped, and how do you again use it as a lesson or an opportunity?
Perfect. And going into kind of the entrepreneurship, being an operator, there's this one CEO that I've always followed and admired. His name's Frank Slootman. He kind of took over Snowflake and ServiceNow, kind of after the founders operated for about 3 years. I wanted to hear your perspective because there often seems a trend where a lot of founders kind of leave the company they started somewhat early on, and then kind of give it off to someone that's proven in operations. I think there's a lot of identity, emotion, and often conflict in that decision, but I was just more curious on how you think of founder-led to operator-led leadership as they scale. What did your experience at OpenTable kind of teach you about the relationship between founders versus, operators like CEOs, kind of do that for a living?
Yeah, I think it's the age-old question from that standpoint. There is a point in time where you go from working in the business to working on the business. So working in the business is
Sure.
actually doing the day-to-day work that gets done, and then working on the business is really building,
Mm,
the process and infrastructure that sort of helps things scale. And I wasn't a person that thinks about process and scale early on. I was more of a person who had my hands in, the product, especially, and really trying to think about the user interface and the scalability of it. And frankly, I'm not sure that there was a chance that the company had less of a chance. Of being successful with, I think, someone else from a product standpoint,
mm,
because of the intricacies and whatnot that we sort of, or that I put into it. However, at some point you've accomplished that sort of body of knowledge and body of work and body of experience
right.
enough to where it then becomes, the next person or someone else. The next step that needs to happen in a company is really, how do you get to that ability to build process and build infrastructure and scale? And so I sort of think about it: idea, validate, process, infrastructure, and scale. You have an idea, you validate it, and that's all sort of the early craziness. And then you start to build process, which is really about, that foundation of scale, because
Right.
scale is doing the same thing over and over and over again at a faster and faster or more efficient rate, right? And so
Mm,
that's what I've been lucky enough to see scale in a number of companies like Grubhub and, OpenTable, and, working with Brian at Braintree for Venmo and stuff like that. And so, this idea of moving from, solving the problem to then actually thinking about how do you then polish all the friction off of that so that actually
yeah.
you can start to scale that. And it is about then process, infrastructure, and then scale, right? And so there's some people who are better at parts of that and other people who are, have the passion or have that early stage stuff. Some people can make the transition. Some people want to make the transition, but some people don't want to, or some people can't, and so, I was one who I wanted to do more of the early stage stuff. I enjoy the early stage stuff. I enjoy that sort of idea of getting to, a certain level. And then there's a handoff that happens where the people who are going to grow it beyond that, they need to be, it's a different skill set of moving, from, 10 miles an hour to 30 miles an hour versus moving
Yeah.
from, 80 miles an hour to 85 miles an hour. Right. And so those are just different skills and, different times of life. Sometimes there's macro environments or macro, issues that happen. Like, again, I said, one of the early things that happened for us is that the dot-com crash happened at OpenTable, and people didn't want to invest
Yeah.
in, sort of younger entrepreneurs. They were looking for, quote unquote, gray hairs. And so that was
You're
the
right.
right time for the company, at least in my experience, to, switch over, at least in our experience. So,
No, that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned Grubhub. Chuck, some people may not know, but you were the first chairman of Grubhub and you were early investor in Grubhub. Grubhub was amazing for me my freshman year when I was ordering food, so it was a lifesaver. So I had to talk about it. You transitioned more into your advisory role as chairman. during a very explosive growth period where I think market share was obviously a little bit hard to gain because there was a good amount of competitors. It was fast moving. I really want to know, and I think everyone would love to hear your perspective on what were one or two decisions that you think were most pivotal in helping them pull ahead of the pack.
Yeah. So to some degree, Mike Evans, had a very similar mindset that I had about, going in and working with these, because this wasn't desktop software where someone's sitting in a controlled environment
Right.
and, had had lots of training and there might be, 6 or 8 ways to go through something. And not that that's not a hard environment to be in, but
Hmm.
it's not as fast paced as sitting there when you've got 6 or 8, customers in front of you who all want to be sat, who are all expecting high levels of service. And the same thing with, high volume delivery restaurants. They're getting order after order after order. They need to make sure that they've got, the good process in place. And Mike, one of the things that Mike did really well, among other things, is really go in and understand how a restaurant worked, what all of their operations were.
Hmm.
Back then, the original sort of delivery mechanism for getting an order into a restaurant was fax machines, right? And so there was no integration with point of sale systems, and there was a couple companies that went out and tried to integrate with point of sale companies, and
Hmm.
technology wasn't so great back then. There was a bunch of Squirrel and Micros and all these other products that just their database structures weren't great. There's just a lot of things that weren't great, and so Mike, instead of making that a problem, actually, worked around it and said, I'm just going to, all restaurants had fax machines at the time. That's how they did a lot of their ordering for,
Right.
supplies and that kind of stuff. And so he just said, I'm going to use the fax machine. And so that was a very, sort of interesting innovation that he did relative
Hmm.
to, needing to get, integrated into all these technologies that he may not be able to do that. So that was one of the innovations that I think he did. The second thing that I think he did, which not a lot of people, there's three things I'll sort of talk about. The second thing that he did was really focus on so when you have a two-sided network, so with OpenTable, the two-sided network was, restaurants and diners, right? And
Right.
so for us, it was really about building what we called the ERB, the electronic reservation book, and that did three things: making, changing, canceling, and confirm. Or sorry, reservation management, guest management, and table management. So making, changing, canceling, confirming reservations,
Hmm.
sort of was guest reservation management. Then there was guest management. Who are my VIPs? When are they coming back? Where are they sitting? And then three was table management. So who's sitting at what table? When's it likely to turn? How am I seating my servers? All those types of questions. So we solved it by building one side of the network by working with restaurants. And so we sold restaurant after restaurant after restaurant. Then there became enough critical mass so that diners started to book reservations online. Because if you went online and there was only one restaurant that was available and it was way across town, your chances of converting were lower.
Yep.
Now, what Mike did, which I think was brilliant, was that he went after the aggregated the diners more, or the people ordering more. And the way that he did that is actually he went out and started in Chicago, found sort of his center mass of the population,
Right.
and started calling all the best restaurants that did delivery, high volume delivery, and he had some of that
Hmm.
he had to figure out. And what he did was he figured out their delivery boundaries, and so then he could just list the phone number, and if you put in your address, 1234 Main Street, he would say, okay, these are all of the restaurants that deliver to you, and no one had ever had that before, the ability to sort of know which restaurants delivered to them. And so then he just put their phone number up, and then they would, someone would search, they would call the restaurant and make a, order online. And then he got to see, because he put a little button that allowed people to click on the button to get the phone number. And so he then knew which restaurants people were booking at or
Hmm.
ordering food from. And so he then was then he could go out and sell them and say, look, if you want to pay the most, you can be at the top of the page. If you don't want to pay as much, you'll be at the lower part of the page. And so he then aggregated the demand side first. And not a lot of other people done that. They've been trying to build both sides at the same time. So he was able to figure out how to sort of, seed one side of the network. And then the third thing that I think that they did, which was pretty innovative, is they had a system in which they could get a menu, and they could sort of OCR the menu. They sent it overseas to a cheaper, labor force, but still certainly highly qualified. And they were able to get, a keying in a menu to go from, I don't know, the number was like 10,000 strokes to key in a menu to like 4,000 strokes, right? And they could do it,
Okay.
they could break it up into three different people and do it, 1,500, keystrokes each. And so they would get menus online for tremendously cheaper, tremendously faster than their others. And so they again were building process to build they built process and infrastructure to make that transition happen. So it dramatically reduced the cost of bringing someone online. So there's a bunch of things like that that I was, as being on the board, the other thing that he made all the board members do is actually work the customer service line for, once a quarter, just so we got
Mhm.
to see what kind of customer service came in and calls like that. So, that whole idea of, moving to, yeah, just, why they were successful and why Mike was successful with Grubhub. To me is, that he was, again, he understood the nuances of what the business needed.
Well, he really he really got into the weeds of it, that's for sure.
Hmm. Yeah.
And then Chuck, I wanted to talk a little bit more about so when you were on the board at Grubhub, but also when you're at OpenTable, you had a very, very legendary investor in a partnership with Bill Gurley. I really wanted to ask you about this because I think Bill Gurley is always in the news, always sharing insight. He's just quite brilliant as a VC. I was curious, what did you learn from working with Bill Gurley? How that ultimately shaped your own philosophy as an investor when you started S2G?
Yeah. I mean, Bill is, the sharpest investor I've ever worked with for
Yeah,
sure, been part of. And his financial discipline of being able to look at a business and truly understand where it was succeeding and where it was failing was second to none. I mean, his ability to do that and not be guessing was incredible, and he was very good at asking direct questions that were related, directly to the problem that was happening, and he did it in a way that, 9 times out of 10 were not, sort of threatening, and every once in a while he'd get, not, and threatening is the wrong word, but like, he would just ask good questions. He,
yeah,
came prepared to board meetings. He, put the work and put the onus on the entrepreneur to be successful, and didn't try and over help entrepreneurs. Again, that whole idea of, you know, um, um, not making it, the bird has to, sort of leave the nest, or the baby bird has to leave the nest at some point. And so, by not building dependencies on him, he was able to, sort of push the entrepreneurs and make them deliver. And so there's just so much about that financial discipline. And the answer to your question is what did I learn? And the real answer is not enough. I should have spent more time focusing on the stuff he said and whatnot, and continue to learn more from that, because there was just a tremendous amount of sort of insight. And he's not a flashy guy. He doesn't come up with 27 ideas every board meeting and have you run down 27 different paths. He's
Mhm.
very thoughtful, very methodical, about sort of the ideas that he comes with. And he's thought through things. This isn't just sort of a I'm going to enlist an idea that comes to mind during the board meeting to go do something. He's very good at, I'm really going, I'm going to be thoughtful about the content I push and how I work with my entrepreneurs. And so that thoughtfulness is, it's there's no one else I've worked with that sort of brought that with them.
Definitely. And kind of jumping topics a little bit, but still focusing on you, Chuck, have built two technology, or you built a technology company, OpenTable. You were very pivotal for Braintree and Grubhub. I wanted to talk a little bit more about AI and software.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of talk about the software apocalypse. I'm sure you've read about it. From AI, it seems that it's really revolutionary. I've even tried coding using ChatGPT and Claude. It amazes me. I can
Yeah.
almost write a full app.
Yeah.
So I was more curious, what are your thoughts on AI replacing software?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I'm so bullish on AI and what it's possible of doing. I think that there's it's going to change definitely how it already has changed, the last 3 months or so,
Mm,
sort of mid late November, early December, sort of the what the models that leap they made during that period of time. I just think it's tremendously broken open, big opportunities for transformation of companies. I don't think it's going to be purely about, how do we um, get super efficient or do downsides and in or riffs or whatever. I think that that's going to be part of the solution. I think people are going to see that that happens, but I also think that a big part of it is how do we deploy your team in ways that can actually go after more greenfield opportunities in the spaces that they're in. But I do feel like there is going to be a fair amount of uh, you know sort of turmoil or unrest that happens in the short term, but super bullish on what's possible for the long term. My perspective is that um, if the models and the capabilities stopped advancing today, we would still be learning new things 3, 4, 5 years from now of what it can
mm,
already do, let alone the advancements that are possible at this particular point in time. So, or where it's going from this point in time. And so I'm super excited. I think it's going to be the curious and the ones who push the needle who are the winners. And I'm doing whatever I can to be part of that. I am having, like you said, a ton of fun. The last time I wrote code was for OpenTable back in probably 1999,
yeah.
maybe 2000, and now this year I've written 8 or 9 apps for our business. I'm learning how to launch agents and mix in um, sort of AI into our
Mm.
platforms and treating looking for the opportunities of where we can enable our teams to be more effective than they've been previously. So I'm super bullish about it. I'm having an amazing time. I'm as energized as I've ever been about the opportunities to be an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and I guess a follow-up to that would just be obviously the AI rivalry with OpenAI, Anthropic. That's very intense, but it seems like every software company, whether that be cyber or fintech, keeps being revolutionary in how it develops. I guess in the long term, when we think of the markets, do you think the market rewards the company that moves the fastest or the one that builds the most trusted AI system?
Yeah. I think there's going to be it's sort of uh 95% of the internet's sort of behind firewalls, right? Or
Mm,
95% of the all the sort of data that's ever been captured is behind firewalls. And so I think between like physical AI and these large data lakes that people have, that's how they'll build their differentiation. It won't be around, is our SaaS system better than someone else's SaaS system? Because I think what happens or what's possible now is people can develop their own SaaS systems, that they want, or their own software solutions that work best for their business. And so
mm,
while software will be, I think, continuing to sort of eat the world, the question will be is where does the value of that eating of the world materialize? And I do think that it will be in companies that have more than just a software moat around their business, unless there's a huge network effect on
mm,
things. Because I do feel like proprietary data, network effects, physical AI, those types of things that enable you to have something that no one else has. Because the models, at least so far, continue to show that they're going to leapfrog each other. And the top model, 4 weeks ago is a different model than the top model is now, which will probably be a different model than 2 weeks from now as well. And so, at least for the foreseeable future, to me, it feels like it is going to be about, the things that the models can't replicate as well. That's where the value creation is gonna materialize.
And I guess then when you think of these already established companies like a Monday.com or like a Salesforce, how do you think of defensibility now? Given that, right, we just mentioned we could quote vibe code
Yeah.
these apps. I guess for the bigger enterprise software companies, is there a bigger need, do you think, on defensibility versus a company that's, still early on scaling?
I mean, I kind of do. I think that public, the larger companies, whether public or private,
Yeah.
who are servicing, large corporate America, there's a steadiness to the infrastructure that they have. They've got these ERP systems, they've got these, databases that have been big and, have a lot of power to them,
Hmm.
and whatnot. And I think those companies are, um, they will atrophy, but they'll atrophy much slower over time versus organizations that have a network effect and
Right.
have multiple types of partnerships and sort of a bunch of diverse customer
Hmm.
relationships and things like that where there's uh, there's a benefit for multiple people being on the network versus like a social media site as an example. Yes, you could rewrite whatever TikTok in 2 weeks, vibe coding or whatever, but the idea of getting the network is
Hmm.
not going to happen anytime soon, right? And so you'd have to really think about how how that ecosystem around that is actually part of the thing that will give it some level of defensibility. I don't know how long. Versus, and I'm going to throw up my air quotes here, but just a database company, which I know there's no such thing as just a database company, but like a database company that doesn't have a network effect to it or a reason it's better because you're on it and I'm on it,
Hmm.
versus like a social network where it's better because you're on it and I'm on it because we can actually communicate. But if a database is quote unquote just a database, then you could be on one database, I could be on another database, and there's not a differentiation there relative to the network effect. And so to me, that makes those models more vulnerable. So people who have ecosystems around them, people who have large sets of data, people who have physical AI, those to me are the models that'll be the most robust.
Well, you mentioned vulnerability, especially if you are kind of starting up and building. It seems like AI is at this point the baseline. So, how do you see AI actually changing the way entrepreneurs now, like early on, build from cost structure, infrastructure to now think growth strategy?
Yeah. I think I think we're in an interesting point where, the smaller company entrepreneurs can come in and potentially have a disruptive um, opportunity against the large enterprise types of companies out there.
Hmm.
And maybe it's not, maybe they don't go after, the Fortune 100 companies out of the gate, but they're going after, maybe the Fortune 2000 companies out of the
Yeah,
gate and being able to come in and, dramatically, um, well, maybe it's not even dramatically. Maybe it's just start to pull the application layer and pull the presentation layer up above the database or up above,
right.
sort of. So yes, you have this database, but maybe there's less seats that happen with it. Maybe there's um, sort of a different kind of licensing that you're using the database for. And then a lot of the other stuff is being, either vibe coded, which can be sometimes, much more customizable. Yes,
Mm.
there's a need for, more IT folks potentially, but, the reality is if you can get it so that people can, um, you know, train you've worked with your team to be able to have data that or capabilities where you're writing your own sort of mini apps or solutions point solutions that solve your particular problem
Yeah,
because the way you work and the way your neighbor works may be doing the same your cube mate or your the person next to you in that company, maybe you both have the same job, but you attack it in very different ways, and that's where the flexibility of being able to vibe code and whatnot allows you to customize and be the most efficient change management. It's going to take some people are going to get frustrated because
Mm,
there's going to be
yeah.
continuous change at the workplace, and so it's going to be there's going to need to be a lot of engaging with the workforce and your teams to be able to help them understand that they need to or how to embrace this environment rather than sort of get frustrated or pissed off by this environment.
And so moving towards more of your investing over the last few years, philosophy, just taking everything we just talked about, want to dive into S2G. So S2G, you guys are focused on food, agriculture, oceans, and energy, areas that have real urgency in climate change and sustainability. You mentioned in your other interviews, you wanted to start thinking a little bit deeper in that when you had your daughter. How do you balance the financial discipline of growth stage investing with the mission-driven nature of what you're backing?
I think there's a world where and maybe even using tools like AI, since we've been talking about that there's opportunities to improve human life while doing it at a way that makes us, that is competitive, from a financial standpoint as well. So there doesn't need to be any sort of sacrifice for doing the right thing, that it actually can be additive. In the past, I've believed that there's a number of forces, and this is again my own belief, but there's a number of forces that are sort of moving in the direction that doing the right thing actually makes a tremendous amount of success. One is human talent. More and more people, at least that I know, anecdotally, are sort of heading towards things they care about and appreciate. There's financial capital. There's more capital going in this direction than ever before. So there's a lot of these types of macro forces to me that are really powerful and sort of bode for the right these opportunities being successful. But again, we'll have to see how that comes along. But I am excited by the prospects of what we're doing.
And when you think of young founders, whether that be something S2G would invest in or you maybe would write an angel check to, I think many young founders today seem to think the first milestone is raising venture capital. Even before they've really proven the product in the market, you obviously mentioned validating idea, but I guess looking back, how should entrepreneurs actually think about fundraising? Should it be the goal or more of a byproduct of building something great?
Yeah, to me, I think that the more you can get done without raising money, the better off you'll be. I mean, investors, pardon the expression, are a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
They want a bunch of things. They want part of your company. They're going to tell you, how to run it, and things like that. And not that we're, all trying to do that, but the idea that um, because constraints are a good thing for an entrepreneur. It's one of my sort of, y- you know, if you have too much money, you'll go in too many directions. You won't make tough decisions. And it sounds sort of counterproductive, but to me, having those constraints and really figuring out how to solve a problem around those constraints is the most constructive way you can move forward as an entrepreneur. And so being able to make sure that you're um, um, being smart financially about it, making sure there's a business model there, making sure, and I get there's a lot of, deep tech and models like that and stuff like that. But even with those, and there's a lot of the stuff out there requires heavy investment. It's a lot of concrete that needs to be poured, and so those are obviously harder models. But the more you can reduce the amount of capital you need to raise, to me, the better off you can be. However, there is a trade-off to that, and that is speed to market to some degree. And
Mhm.
so, if you're sitting there on a wave and you're out surfing and you don't paddle, you may miss the wave. But if you do paddle, you may out paddle the wave and sort of not be on the right part of it and crash out before you can get up on the wave. So it is I'm not sure there's a right answer to it, but I am a strong believer in raising less capital out of the gate until you get to some level of product market fit, and then figuring out, what's the right acceleration. And again, that's in a perfect world. We're not all part of perfect worlds, but anyway.
I guess the last question to just close, many of my listeners are Gen Z. You're hearing a lot about AI potentially replacing entry-level jobs and making the job market more competitive. What advice do you have to college graduates about the skills they should focus on, and types of roles they should pursue in this environment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm bullish of the opportunity of AI. I think that, if I'm being honest, the best thing that you could do is lean into it and try and learn it. There's going to be a lot of people who push back on it and don't learn it, and so I think being able to show up and show how you can bring value with it, being a little bit humble that there's a lot of experience out there for what it takes to do the job, but how to do the job, that you can bring those sort of skills of knowing AI. I think that's hugely valuable. So I personally would lean into it, and one of the things I've told both my daughters is I'll buy any AI app you want as long as you're using it, type of thing. And so I would lean into using it at every moment, just to understand how it works, understand the nuances of it, understand what's possible, and then go build some stuff. I mean, build.
Perfect. Awesome. Chuck, thank you so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it. Love the insights. Thank you
Awesome,
again.
Logan. Good luck.
All
Thank you.
right. Thank you.